Welcome to our first lecture where we take a deep dive into our assigned textbook, the Latino, Latina condition. I don't know if you noticed there's a little A in there as well to be all-inclusive. This mini lecture is where I will introduce a big concept from our textbook and then go deeper by pulling a few key quotes from the assigned readings. So our first reading, Chapter 8, the question of race. The big concept in Chapter 8 is that we move from ethnocentric bias, which is a term that we introduced in our culture and psychology textbook. We move from ethnocentric bias to a specific Eurocentric bias, one type of ethnocentric bias. This Eurocentric bias, the big concept, is something that grew out of our history of indigenous conquest and slavery. Let's go deeper. Let's see, page 42. Even though my color stayed the same, the perception and sometimes its valuation or its value changed. So from this quote, I gather we can learn that how others value me and assign me status will change. Not based off of my changing, but based off of the lens that other people tend to view me through. Remember that ethnocentric lens that we view others through? So that's the perception that changes rather than the actual skin color changing. On page 43, we learn, in addition to being reclassified by others without their consent, some Latinos shift their own self-classification during their lifetime. So what a privilege it is to be the person who gets to do the classifying and the reclassifying. Not so much the person who's getting classified because they're not giving their consent, they're not giving their permission. So the person who gets to change classifications, that's the person who has the privilege to even do the changing. Shouldn't I be able to classify myself? And when I do it, it's only after I give you permission? Like, where does my consent happen? Where does your consent happen? This author goes further to say on page 43, I have known Latinos who became Black, then white, then human beings, and finally again Latino, all in a relatively short time. So the question of race is part of who gets to determine the race. Is it the person, or is it someone else who's viewing the person? These are some critical thinking questions we're starting to ask. Not that there's a simple answer. And then we learn of this term mestizaje. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Mestizaje as a way of resisting a world that emphasizes purity and separation. Remember that history of conquest and slavery that we have in this country? Well, that history emphasizes purity and separation. So how are we to fight back? How are we to resist? How are we to liberate ourselves from this oppressive way of thinking and separating people? This type of language, this word is an example of language that leads to new identity formation. And we learn that mestizaje on the bottom of page 43 is a view that affirms mixture, not purity and separation. Very simple quote. One is either white or not white. Now, many people think that race is a given and that it doesn't change for anyone at any time. Those people are wrong. And those people certainly haven't thought about race from the perspective of a Latino or Latina. Oh, and also this either or thinking is very black or white, right or wrong, yes or no. There's no gray area in this type of thinking. And so much of life is actually occupied in the gray area, not yes or no. So this type of thinking is very problematic, especially when dealing with people, because we're complex. With all that being said, page 45, this does not mean that race as understood by Latinos does not have overtones of racism or implications of power and privilege in either Latin America or the US. So even though Latinos approach race differently, there's still power structure and elitism. There's still an imbalance of privilege, of who gets what and when. And they go on to say, and white rules over color within the same class. Those who are lighter have differential access to some dimensions of the market. So, racism could be reframed as maybe like powerism or privilegeism when it comes to communities of color, if I could make up a word. And of course, on a positive note, change is possible. On page 47, the author calls for a radical re-examination of the concept of race by the U.S. government. Let's see, we see from between the years 1800 and 2000, so 200 years, the U.S. Census Bureau, for the first time this is the last sentence. For the first time in the 2000 census, respondents were allowed to choose more than one racial group when answering the question about race. So, change is possible. It took 200 years, and we're definitely not where we need to be, but we aren't where we were in the 1800s. And I, for one, sure am glad about that. The next reading, Chapter 9. The big concept from Chapter 9 is that the traditional white American identity is being challenged. And furthermore, since by 2050, it is estimated that whites will make up less than 50% of the U.S. population, less than half. Hispanic groups will not benefit, however, from being considered white. What does that mean? Let's go deeper. All right. First major quote, page 48. As the American identity evolves, the decreasing white majority must find new ways to preserve the white national identity. Let's see. The census will be the tool used to narrow the understanding of ethnicity and broaden the definition of whiteness in efforts to maintain the current American identity. So this author says that in the U.S., the census has served as a device to include and exclude groups within the national identity. And what I got from the first page of this reading is that the census is the tool. The census will be how white privilege gets reclassified and redefined so that people of color do not benefit from being considered white. Let's see, yeah. In the United States, the census has served as a device to include and exclude groups within the national identity. So when we talk about how racism exists more than only on individual levels, racism exists on system levels. So you might have heard the term systemic racism, meaning like there's racism in the power structures and the systems of this country more so than what your personal thoughts on racism are. Systemic racism, a concrete example of that would be the U.S. Census Bureau. That is a governmental system, and regardless of what you and I think, the government's in charge of the U.S. Census Bureau. And they're in charge of how they classify and reclassify white identity and other racial and ethnic identities. So if you're thinking of dismantling racism, check out job openings at the U.S. Census Bureau. Okay, let's see. If categorized as white, discrimination against members of these groups will only be harder to trace, and protection will be more difficult to obtain. This author goes on to say Hispanic groups will not benefit, however, from being considered white. So, even if some groups that are people, even if some people of color groups are considered white, they will still be discriminated against. It'll be more subtle and harder to trace, harder to take someone to court for discriminating against another person of color if they're technically considered white. Society will have to redefine whiteness and include Latinos if whites are to maintain a numerical majority. I like that this language is free of judgment. These are objective facts. You know, there's no like, these people suck, and isn't it bad? Like, no, here are some numerical majority numbers, and here are what people's choices are going to be, and here are what options they're going to be faced with based on these numbers. So we haven't introduced any judgment. We're only sticking to numbers right now. I want to know, do you think that will happen? Do you think Latinos will be included to inflate the number of whites as majority in the American identity? And then I really like this question. Will history repeat itself? Yes, it will. Even though in the last reading we learned that it took 200 years for history to redefine itself, not repeat itself. But on page 52, the second paragraph, the author says, recognizing Hispanic identity as ethnicity rather than race, and then requiring Hispanics to choose a recognized race will force Hispanics to fall in line with the traditional black-white binary. Binary means two, either or, black or white, yes or no, right or wrong. We learned that that type of thinking is problematic because humans are very complex creatures. We are social animals and we are complex. So reducing something complex to a simplified version, and then putting that simplified version in a category that doesn't even match, that's a recipe for disaster and confusion, and also for oppression, being able to take advantage of people by calling them something that they aren't. Remember when a Spanish conquistador sailed to America and called a whole bunch of people something that they weren't? Christopher Columbus landed in a place that wasn't India and said, "This is India, right?" And they're like, "No, this is another place." And he was like, "Nah, you're Indians." So, yes, history is certainly repeating itself. I don't know if you listen to comedy, but Louis C.K. has a sketch on Christopher Columbus saying, "This is India, right?" Like, "No, this is a totally other place." "You mean you aren't Indians?" "No, we're something else." You're Indians. Like, say what you will about comedians, but that particular comedian did speak about a really important racial commentary about who has the privilege of deciding what people are called. Okay. A simple change of classification does not erase a past filled with discrimination, stereotypes, and stigma. Does not erase a past. For example, in 1848, the United States promised all Mexicans remaining in the U.S. full citizenship rights, but virtually taxed and licensed them out of existence with the political, economic, and social infrastructures. During the gold rush, an onslaught of lynchings and murders aimed to force Mexican Americans to release any mining claims they may have had. To this day, Latinos are seen as bringing an inferior welfare and crime-prone culture into the United States. The welfare stereotypes continue, even though Latino men are employed at a higher rate than any other population group. On television between 2001 and 2002, Latinos represented only 2% of primetime characters, which is far from actual national population percentages. So even though we're talking about the privilege of classifying and reclassifying, changing the name doesn't change the past, doesn't change the present. It maybe starts with the name, but it does not end with naming and classifying. We need to actually change behaviors, change discrimination practices, change the way that we hire people, change the way that we portray people on television. What will the next 200 years bring? And let's get down to the bottom line. The bottom line is always money. Redefining Latino groups will also have an effect on the way federal funds are allocated and affect the data on discrimination methods in collections. Redefining Latino groups will also... Oh, that part that I read. Next sentence. Let's talk about money. More than 100 billion of the dollars, billion with a B, more than that, are allocated each year based on census data. So you're like, why does it matter how we classify people on census data? Because money is tied to it. The data collected by the census on racial enumeration have supplied the foundation for civil rights enforcements. Let's see. If Latinos are defined solely or only as white, they will not benefit from the same privileges poor white communities did in the past. History demonstrates, here we go with history. History demonstrates that white communities benefited economically from the subordination of minority groups. So the only way that power has worked is if some groups have it and other groups don't. This last sentence really gets me. There will be no equality in the poor white communities when a former Hispanic, now a poor white, is discriminated against because of his or her differences. So how do we connect this information to what we learned about culture and human nature? Well, I didn't want to leave you here without defining and discussing race and ethnicity, particularly how the history of slavery and segregation have shaped the cultures within communities of color. Pardon me. And another one of the goals of the first unit of this course is what to think about next. How has racism shaped and impacted the mental and physical health of people of color, POC, both historically and presently? And I'd like you to think about how racism impacts mental and physical health with health outcomes, with life expectancy, access to resources, social class. There is no right or wrong answer. There's no assignment based on this, but my invisible assignment is to spark you into thinking about these kinds of things, especially using language more mindfully and classifying people according to, maybe how they want to be classified rather than how you're told to classify them by the government who's pulling strings to send money into the places that support the weird classes and take power away from the classes that have not had power in this country, have not had long life expectancy, have not had access to resources. Okay. That's my very brief lecture. I'm so glad I got through it in less than 50 minutes. Up next, you have cultural evolution. Bye now.